Good morning, everyone. I'd like to get started. We've got a very packed agenda. We've got some great speakers and a very complicated and challenging subject, so we'll start now. Thank you all, and those of you in the back, if I can play the role of the preacher, ask you to come up front. Don't be afraid to sit up front. It'd be great and enjoying the conversation. I am your moderator. My name is Michael Connor. I'm Executive Director of Open Mic, which is a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to foster greater corporate accountability in the media and tech sectors, and we do that largely through shareholder engagement. Our panel today is called Social Responsibility in the Technology Sector. What is the role of investors? And we've got a great panel, and I will introduce them now. To my immediate left is Pooja Daftari, who is with MFS Investment Management, where she works on ESG issues. Sitting next to Pooja is Will Lana. Your program may have said you should expect Jonas Krohn. Jonas Krohn, unfortunately, had a family emergency, couldn't be here, so Will is substituting for Jonas, but Will's very familiar with technology, having introduced Trillium's shareholder proposal this year at Facebook, and is very knowledgeable on that. Next to Will is Melanie Nakagawa, who is head of the Climate Initiative at Princeville Global. And next to Melanie is Mariela Vargova, who is a senior VP with Rockefeller Asset Management. We're going to turn to the panel in a second, but I thought, moderator's prerogative, I might try to frame the discussion a little bit, and I have a few slides. And I thought I'd start with my first desktop computer, which is about 30 years ago. It was a Mac SE made by Apple. The Mac SE had a 20 megabyte hard drive, if you can imagine that. It was a 20 megabyte hard drive, and as I recall, the computer, the software, and the printer cost well over $4,000. It was a fortune at the time for me. But these days, we have a whole bunch of much smaller devices. We have laptops, we have smartphones, and virtually everyone in this room probably has a smartphone, either in your pocket or in your purse. And they have hard drives of 60 gigabytes, 120 gigabytes. I'm not very good at math, but it's an exponential factor larger than 20 megabytes. And as we all know, they can do everything. They can perform an enormous range of functions. They're word processors, they're telephones, text messages, cameras, music devices, you name it, and these small devices can do it. In fact, these digital technologies, and I think that's the way we have to think about these things, not just computers, not just phones, but digital devices and digital technologies, they're creeping into almost every facet of our lives. They're certainly in our homes, where they can control the temperature, they can make it hotter, or they can make it colder. They can manage your home security system, if you have a home security system. And they've also become a critical element, for example, in medicine. People have wireless devices, hard to believe, but wireless devices in their brains. Maybe that's an improvement at times. They have it in their pacemakers. And in a whole range of things. There are devices that help people, thousands, tens of thousands of people, manage diabetes on a regular basis, thanks to wireless digital technologies. Digital technologies are being used in the financial industry, helping banks, for example, make judgments, collect data about how people manage. Something we're going to hear about a little bit later in the panel, I think. So there's a whole range of things that they do. They're also very critical for those of you interested in climate change. They're also involved in driverless cars, which we've been told are coming any day now, probably going to take a lot longer than that. But again, digital technologies are creeping into virtually every aspect of our lives. In the business, they call this the Internet of Things. Everything is connected, one device to another, with all the data being stored in the cloud, wherever the cloud is. We're not really sure where the cloud is, but there is a cloud and there's enormous amounts of data stored there. And it's driven by companies that have enormous market capitalizations, which is where you all come in. Apple recently became the first company with $1 trillion market cap. Amazon has flirted with that. I think it reached it one day and it fell back a little bit. But we will have more companies with $1 trillion capitalizations. How did they get here? Well, one of the things that people in this part of the world, in Silicon Valley and elsewhere in the tech industry, they'll tell you that the magic in this business is that there were no rules. In fact, there still are pretty much no rules, and that's the magic of the tech industry. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg, the chairman and CEO of Facebook, the founder of it, for many years had a motto, and it was move fast and break things. Unless you are breaking stuff, you are not moving fast enough. Now, I invite you to contrast that with the driving force and the ethic of ESG and sustainable investing. Compare that, move fast and break things. Unless you're breaking stuff, you're not moving fast enough. Nowhere in there are we anticipating consequences. Nowhere in there are we talking about externalities. We're just moving fast and breaking things and making a lot of money. So you might ask, what could go wrong? Well, a lot of things, and we're beginning to see some of them. Some of the many things that we should and should be worried about. One of them is corporate governance, for example. How are these companies run? How are they managed? To whom are they accountable? Do they care what shareholders think? Another issue, and two issues, and really interrelated, privacy and data security. What happens to all the data that companies get about you and your family and your communities? What do they do with it? We know, for example, that oftentimes it's hacked and stolen by bad actors. But even when the company has control of that data, what do they do with it? And is our personal data, especially on social media platforms, being used to improperly influence elections, sow the seeds of hate in our communities? These are issues that the social media platforms are dealing with right now. There's also the issue of, for example, artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence, AI as they called it, or machine learning in some cases, we're being told can do enormous, wonderful things, and it is already doing that. It may help us solve the challenge of climate change. It will be a big factor in that. Scientists say it could help cure cancer and other diseases. These are wonderful things. At the same time, alarms are sounding very loudly across the board about the possible negative impacts of algorithms and artificial intelligence. So as more and more companies get into data-driven applications, they're discovering and using these applications to make mortgages, make determinations about who gets social benefits, how the government is run. They're discovering that algorithms oftentimes have baked-in bias, is what it's called, and it leads to unintended discriminatory outcomes. So another thing to worry about. And then finally, what do these technologies, very broadly, how do they impact human capital? How do they impact ourselves and our families? There was a session just yesterday talking about Amazon, one of the lead tech companies, and how does Amazon treat its employees? How does it treat its customers? And then what happens to the data about our children? And are our children using these devices? How are they using them? Are they using them too much? Big questions, not enough answers. I think the bottom line on all of this is that with all these digital technologies, we can't, as they say, we can't live with them in some ways, but we certainly, these days, we can't live without them. So to help us understand some of that and what's going on, we have our panel, who are going to talk a little bit about various aspects of digital technologies and ESG investing. I'm going to start with Pooja, I think. And Pooja, how do we? Pooja has the answer.
Okay, can you hear me? Great, thank you. So we at MFS have been looking a lot at emerging markets and tech ethics issues that have arisen there. We read a lot about Facebook in the news, the issues with the US election. But emerging markets, there are kind of sea changes going on as well, and I think we have to look at the implications of those changes in our investment portfolios. So one area where we've been focusing a lot is the government interest in data, the government influence in data, and their participation and growing participation in non-governmental companies, private sector companies, especially the tech companies. Many governments are looking at data. They are trying to use it to either cement their power or, in many cases, improve the benefits to society in terms of access to healthcare, access to financial services by improving credit to unbanked populations in rural areas, et cetera. And they are further integrating their systems with business systems, and that is where we have the investment issues. So there are two EM systems, emerging market systems, that are particularly interesting to me and to us. So the first would be the unique identification system in India, which is called the Aadhaar card system, where the government has essentially gone out in conjunction with the private sector and built a biometric database to identify every single citizen in India. And that data is then kept with the government. It has now been made mandatory. So to do anything, like to get your driver's license or to pay your income tax returns, you need to have this identification data. And businesses have taken it a step forward by making that identification data their key point of contact with their customers and getting to know their customers. So one is, the one risk that it poses is that data security is very poor. I believe the data was hacked a couple of months ago and sold on the internet. So 300 million users' data was sold on the internet for $3 just a few months ago. So data security is a key issue. And then the other concern is privacy. Will the government use individual data for surveillance purposes? And then China takes it even a step further, the government's use and control of data. So China has created what is called a social scoring system, whereby individuals are assigned social scores, and the government wants to use these scores to modify behavior within society to increase ethics. At least that's kind of what has been disclosed. The question is, the kinds of data that they use is really far-ranging from, whether you're taking rides on Uber or Didi, your social media data, that's all accessible to the government in a central data repository, which leads to massive data privacy concerns. And then in addition to that, the government has created a scoring mechanism based on measures, some of which are transparent, but some of which are really opaque. So things like looking at whether you pay your taxes on time or you pay your loans off, those kinds of measures make sense. Even Western countries, in a way, kind of keep that data of individuals and use it when they extend loans, et cetera. But then there are also things like your family planning decisions, your religious affiliations, political affiliations. Some of the data points are like the number of hours spent playing video games, whether you buy, diapers on the internet, or whether you buy, video games or cigarettes or alcohol. And those very opaque measures are used to compute the social scores. And now that can lead to severe human rights violations. And the way the private sector gets involved in this is because the government will use the private sector to mete out a system of rewards and punishments to individuals based on these social scores. So the rewards would include access to better schools and hospitals, access to cheap credit, but then the punishment system could be the opposite of that you're barred from living in certain areas. If you are a business entity with a bad social score, you may not be able to participate in the credit markets. And so there are so many different ethical issues that arise here, and that the private sector like Baba, Tencent, Baidu, they are going to be used by the government to mete out this system of punishments and rewards. So if you are shopping on Alibaba, you cannot buy luxury handbags if your social score is weak, because it's one of the sanctions that's been kind of levied by the government. And this is kind of what we're working on these days at MFS, and trying to integrate these evolving political systems, the involvement in technology, with our views on the tech sector.
Well, We've heard about governments and cooperating with companies, probably one of the most ubiquitous companies. Who here is not on Facebook? Oh, that's a large number. Well, Will's here to talk a little bit about Trillium's engagement with Facebook.
Yeah, who here is not investing in Facebook? There'd probably be less hands raised. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I just want to underline how sorry Jonas is that he can't be here today. He had a family medical emergency, very much wanted to be here. But what I did want to talk about was some engagement that we've had with Facebook over the last year. We're an ESG specialist and have been so for 30 years. So I think a good place to start is a comment that maybe a lot of us have also heard Mark Zuckerberg made recently. I don't need to go over the controversies. I think we're all aware there's been significant social controversies at Facebook. And what he has said is that Facebook didn't take a broad enough view of its responsibility as a company. And we agree with that statement as far as it goes, but that kind of raises other questions for us, and the main question is why? Why didn't Facebook take as broad of a view as it should have? And when we dug in a little bit deeper, being ESG investors, what we really found was two root causes on the governance side that made a company more prone to having a social controversy. And so the first thing that we looked at was how the board talks about risk oversight. When does that conversation happen? Where is the responsibility? And really maybe kind of that quote that you saw come in there before shows you kind of how the culture was in a place where there wasn't really clearly delineated places to talk about risk at the board level. The governance documents didn't really bring the subject up. And so we noticed that some other technology companies like Microsoft and a lot of other sectors will have a risk oversight committee at the board level and have some clearer responsibility there. And so we thought that that was a good suggestion to make to Facebook. So we filed a shareholder proposal in October, essentially laying out that best practice. Harvard Law School Forum Conference Board all said, not just for Facebook, for companies in general, having risk oversight at the board level spelled out is important. We filed that in October. In February, Cambridge Analytica came out and the sharing of the 87 million individuals' personal data, and that kind of really, I think, crystallized that issue in everyone's minds. So the company came out initially against the proposal, saying that the adequate system was in place, went to the annual meeting, received 45% vote of the non-insiders. So obviously Zuckerberg has a majority shares there, so you're not going to get a majority vote without his support, but that was a strong showing. And in June, Facebook did update their governance guidelines, essentially in line with what we asked for. So the audit committee is now the Audit and Risk Oversight Committee, and there's specific language added on around cybersecurity, data privacy, and also interesting, anything that would undermine the public safety and public interest. And that we felt that was a good step, makes Facebook a better investment going forward, not just for the controversies that have already happened, but especially preventing future controversies moving forward. So the one other area, just real quickly, and I won't go into a lot of depth, that we saw that could potentially weaken the governance at Facebook is the fact that you have a CEO and board chair and that you don't have an independent board chair. And I think, again, we're all investors, and it's really kind of broadly accepted that superior governance setup is to have an independent board chair. That's probably even more so important at Facebook. One, because the product is so ubiquitous and so the consequences are serious. But two, because Mark Zuckerberg has that majority shareholder position too, they're really the checks and balances, the balance of power essentially is off when you have one person being the CEO, the board chair, and then also being the majority shareholder. There's just some questions again about how comfortable other people on the board feel even up bringing up critical items. So we've put forward that resolution for 2019. Treasurer of the state of Illinois has been out talking about this issue. There was actually a proposal on a separate independent board chair that got a majority of shareholder votes a couple years back by a group of some of us. We know it's a heavy lift, that Zuckerberg is not going to be eager to relinquish his chairmanship, but we also feel it's really important that that question is being asked. and then it's out there, and that institutional investors, feel like they've got an avenue to understand why Facebook feels like that's the best governance structure for them to look at risk. So I'll leave it there for now.
Okay. I'm going to ask Mariella to jump in here and talk a little bit, because I know corporate engagement is one of the things you do. And tell us a little bit more about what companies you're engaged with.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. At Rockefeller Asset Management, we have a global approach in terms of how we look at best practices in technology sector, and we seek engagements with both U.S. companies and also in other markets. So we do compare how companies are reacting and what is their governance model. And just to let you know, from an long-term investor perspective, 10 years ago, the big technology companies, they were really symbol of business innovation. They were of an unprecedented connectivity and democratization of information. They also always been a symbol of stewards of environmental sustainability. We hear today from Facebook and Apple how they're leading the way of the low carbon economy, making big commitments to 100% renewable use of energy in their procurement and operational practices. At the same time, we also as investors, we see that alongside those big achievements, there's been always systemic issue in the governance model of companies, of these companies, systemic issues that brought poor transparency and also lack of accountability, especially in a way companies have been traditionally talking to shareholders. Just last year, for the first time, Amazon organized 2 ESG calls with investors globally. That was the first outreach after so many institutional investors will reach out to them and seek to start a conversation on ESG-related issues. Similarly, Facebook, we really needed to reach the Cambridge Analytica scandal for Facebook to return the calls to ESG investors and to start a dialogue. Last week, Google, for the first time that I'm aware, had their first ESG call with the shareholders globally. So I think the big tech companies are long overdue in their shareholder engagement, and in a way, what a missed opportunity to develop constructive dialogue with us, so we could have, over the years, we could have really worked on issues of governance, on human capital management, risk management, and I believe many of the problems today could have been mitigated if they had a constructive dialogue with us. But I'm hopeful because, as Google committed last week, they will have a quarterly ESG calls from now on, and we look forward to continue our dialogue with them.
That's terrific. I hadn't heard that about Google. That's great. Melanie, you've got a broader view of all this in terms of what technology is and what we should be thinking about.
Sure, great, thank you so much. And kudos to all of you for being here strong on Friday. By show of hands, who was just there in the Paul Pullman session? Okay, good. So I thought it was actually such a great segue to this session. A lot of the themes he covered, I really resonated with me in particular. And so just a quick background. I work for Principal Global. We're a growth stage technology investment firm that's focused on delivering strong returns and climate positive impact for our investors. And so in the process of developing our fund and thinking through climate impact, and also in the context of the week that we're all in with what's happening down the street on climate change and what Paul spoke about earlier today, I thought it'd be a good time for this panel on social issues and social responsibility in tech investing to sort of broaden the horizon of how we think about the S. Again, you probably joined this panel thinking we're talking about the S of ES and G, or maybe social impact, but it's really sort of broad. And so I wanted to take this moment to really reflect upon how we view the S in ESG and really where we see the trends that are happening. The first in particular, and I thought the opening slides were really terrific, really goes to speak to the issue that when it comes to social impact and social responsibility, there's an evolution in tech investing. And Mariella made a really good point about where tech companies have evolved and are evolving. In particular, we're seeing that technology is increasingly seeking a social impact. Those who work in the technology sector are seeking a social impact, but technology itself is seeking a social impact. Second trend we keep on seeing is that for when it comes to social impact, that's going to require new technologies and new business models. At the same time coming together, and what many of you in the room here are doing as well, is investors are now being asked to respond to what kind of impact they're having, the social impact of their investments. But in return, they're also looking for returns that are going to give you that social impact. And so with these sort of three, if we had a slide, be a perfect Venn diagram, and I know we all love Venn diagrams, so you see this nice sort of confluence of sort of impact and capital, as well as technology, all coming together to create this moment in time where we are today. And in particular, the social impact that we're most involved with from Principal Global, but also, again, this week a big topic is the social impact of climate change and how climate change can be viewed from a social lens in addition to just the environmental lens. So let me just expand upon that a little bit more and how we view the social impact and how climate change relates to that. In particular, we're looking at technologies that are addressing the social impact of climate change to deliver a healthier planet. Technologies like clean air pollution sensor technologies that monitor air quality, that monitor, frankly, the temperature of your home or the pollutants around your neighborhood or in your home. We're also seeing technologies to provide a healthier ecosystem. So again, on natural resources, Paul made a really good point about the use of natural resources. How are we supporting the reduced consumption, a circular economy, addressing water scarcity and drought issues. And then finally, all those together create a healthier planet. And really, we heard about the world about 5 years ago was looking on track to a 4.7 degree warming by the end of the century. We've been able, through lots of cumulative action from all stakeholders involved, public, private, investors alike, bringing it down to 3 degrees. And then ideally our target's 1.5. And so again, what is the role of technology in shaping those patterns and how is that? And this is all, again, creating a social impact for people, planet, and the ecosystem. And so now, as a result, you're actually seeing a rise in technology to meet this demand. And that's really where we sit. We're seeing a really sort of hardy ecosystem of venture funding, late-stage funding like ourselves, seed and accelerators developing, all with the purpose and mission of looking at technologies to meet this demand to address the social impacts of climate change, whether it's on people, planet, or ecosystems. You're looking at advanced mobility systems, ways to move cars more efficiently, electrified, fuller in capacity. Just earlier this week, PRI hosted a workshop on low-carbon technologies and the role of venture capital and private equity in spurring on greater acceleration of this. And so that's, again, sort of this is all within the theme of what we're seeing. And then lastly, the key piece on the climate and the social impact, just to, again, the way we views this is that climate change is both we need to reduce our emissions and reduce the type of contribution we're putting into the environment. But then there's also this impact that we're seeing, frankly, in real time on the East Coast. You saw this about a month ago here in California in terms of the impacts that we're already seeing today of climate change, whether it's forest fires, increased forest fires, category 4, it's downgraded to 2, but these massive storms that are brewing throughout the planet and throughout these various regions. And these sort of increased impacts are also creating the need for technologies to adapt to them. So whether it's technologies to make us more resilient and more robust, or technologies that help us reduce it. And I'll close with just an example to give you an example about, again, why for us ESG is part of the conversation but not sufficient when it comes to climate. And a good example I like to give is for those who may actually work in a LEED certified building, but LEED certification is a type of environmental gold standard for an environmental sustainably built building. And for a long time, LEED certification was focused on energy efficiency and low carbon development. And as part of that, if you are building with a server, the logical place to put your server would be in the basement because it's very hot, it needs to be cooled, and it's the coolest place in your basement. And so a lot of LEED certification buildings, you saw a server in the basement. So if you're LEED Gold, LEED Platinum, that's sort of how you were designed. But then in New York City, when Hurricane Sandy came through, one of the things they found was the first thing that flooded was the basement, and that's where their server was. And so that's just an example, again, about when, how is it that when you look at ESG or environmental sustainability, how you might inadvertently miss climate resilience or climate impacts. And so we've spent a lot of time at Princeville thinking through how do we make sure that we're accounting for the climate-specific material impacts as we think through ES&G. And then I think at our next, when we go back and forth, we'll talk more about some of those tools. So thank you.
Pooja, you spoke about the relationship of companies and government, one of the stereotypes of Big Brother is that the government is watching you. And in fact, most governments are not watching people. It's companies that are watching people. How do investors, people in this room, tease out some of these issues? What lessons are there?
I think there's a good case study to actually illustrate the point that you just made. I think the right case study in this case is to look at consumer credit and consumer lending practices, which have raised a lot of issues in China. So on the business side, what we've seen is internet companies have developed their own credit scoring systems. And they really have followed this policy of move fast and break things, as you referenced earlier. And to some extent, they really are fulfilling a critical need in society, a need for consumer credit and for small and medium-sized businesses who are generally blocked out of the credit market by larger state-owned entities who suck up most of the loans from the banks. So yes, they do provide a very important function, especially where one that the government has not been able to fulfill. But at the same time, the industry has grown so fast that government regulation has not been able to keep pace with it. They haven't quite been able to understand how the changes that are happening because they are precisely happening so fast. And so what we've seen in terms of tangible examples is that many times the way credit scores are being computed can be either transactional, in which case you're looking at the movement in your checking account balance, the pattern of paying bills, your purchasing patterns, utility bills, etc. And these can be predictive sources of cash flow movements and are typically pretty predictive of your credit worthiness. However, companies in their bid to be innovative are now moving into using social media and social information, like who you're friends with, for example, who you transact with, in order to compute these credit scores. And based on this sort of information that is a lot more opaque, they then sanction certain individuals with low credit scores, and you as an individual don't even know what your credit score is being computed on. And that could lead to growing inequality or marginalization of a certain segment of the population. Redlining, which has been a ethical issue even in the United States, for example, and there are regulations against this in this country, but not so in China. So that's on the business side. And then the conflation is with the government side of things, where the government's creating social scoring systems. What the government is trying to do is get all these individual credit scoring systems under one umbrella called the China Union System, a unified credit system of China, whereby the government has access to all this data and they compute their own government credit scores. But the question is that the social credit information and your social credit scores will be used to compute that credit score. So what essentially this tells me is that if you have a poor social score, it's going to block you out of the credit markets. It's going to deprive you of access to home loans, for example. And if the government can do this in a manner that pushes out certain sections that they see to be dissidents, it could really increase human rights violations, it could increase marginalization of minorities, and we're seeing increasing trends in both those fields. And I think the third example just is, there are, in addition to human rights, data privacy, there are wider social ramifications of businesses growing too fast in the credit lending space. And that is, these are untested credit models, and they might lead to non-performing loan cycles in a manner that we haven't seen before, because the models themselves are untested. And we've seen credit bubbles in the past in other Asian countries. Like, look at the credit card crisis in Korea that we had in the 90s and the 2000s, where credit card debt for individuals rose so fast, so quickly, that you had people who couldn't pay their bills committing suicide, or you had family members that were basically held accountable to pay these bills off for their family members who couldn't. And so we have really wide social ramifications ramifications. And we're seeing that today in China in the peer-to-peer lending system that's caused a lot of social unrest because these companies were allowed to go unregulated for so long and have built up a lot of non-performing loans in the system.
One of the clear themes that emerges in a lot of this is people think that computers are logical and that they make logical, rational decisions. And in many ways, one of the themes that pops up, at least at Open Mic's work, is you see that these computer systems, artificial intelligence, reinforce many of the traditional biases that we've had to live with. And that's one of the things I think you're pointing out, Pooja. Will, in your engagement with Facebook, I mean, one of the questions is when you present these issues to a company like Facebook, you're a smart guy, and Trillium's a smart company, and Jonas Krona's a smart guy. When you bring those issues to Facebook, what kind of a reaction do you get? Can they be taught?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's not always the case that you're greeted with open arms, and certainly every company has a little bit of a different culture. I would say overall, I think it was a reasonable engagement. Again, we just brought up the risk committee issue in October, and then in less than 9 months, they had a policy change.
But
I think that
they would not admit to you that they made that policy change.
That's true, and I would say that, and sometimes there are companies that will do that, and so essentially, might do a joint press release together and really be kind of viewed as like this helpful consultant in some ways. But from Trillium's perspective, that's not necessarily, we don't necessarily asking the company to give us credit for our idea. We're just glad we kind of put it out there in the conversation, and if they feel that they independently derive that or didn't weren't influenced too much by shareholders. For us, really the important thing is kind of reducing that risk. Both a financial risk and a social risk for the company. And so I think, again, a lot of the steps that Facebook has taken, in the last year have been reactive, and we would say kind of more of a whack-a-mole approach to past controversies. So they've had all these new people, and you'll hear Mark talk about this a lot, that are kind of weeding through the fake news, and it does look like that's making a difference. And I think that's, if you're taking a very narrow view of the controversy, then that's an effective measure. But hiring those people to weed out fake news doesn't necessarily help you set up a structure that avoids controversies in the future, which might be in a kind of a different, unrelated area. Again, they've had controversies in Myanmar and South Sudan. Refugees have been getting kidnapped and ransomed over Facebook. Racial affinity groups have been excluded from advertisers, and in some cases advertisers have been targeting people who use racial slurs, So there's certain things, again, where I think there's been enough controversies that haven't been on the top of the headlines, but things that you would hope that the company would be thinking through. And so I would say, again, I think it was, reasonable. I think that they, again, it's good that the CEO is saying that they want to take a broader view of the responsibility and then really thinking about what that means. I think one thing that we've seen in the recent controversies is that a lot does kind of fall on Mark's shoulders in terms of the responsibility. And from a, maybe a communication strategy, it is good for the CEO to take responsibility. But I think when a sophisticated investor digs in, you also want to see a system and a structure in place that the responsibility would be more broadly shared. And then what we found was that system wasn't necessarily there. So the piece that this risk oversight committee does, one, there's legal kind of ramifications there for the board members. So now, failing to look at some of these social risks there's legal incentives for the board to make sure they cover it at those meetings. And then Erkson Bowles, who's the chair of the Risk Oversight and Audit Committee, again, he's going to be laser focused on making sure that that's brought up. I think a lot of times when you have too much on the CEO's shoulders is they're missing out on really valuable insights that, they have a very accomplished board there at Facebook. And so are you making the most of a board? And the Council of Institutional Investors, part of the reason they like that independent chairman is because it essentially makes a clear separation of powers and makes it clear that the chairman is really kind of providing oversight to management, which also is providing this, kind of outside perspective that can be really valuable. And so I think that the conversations there at the board level will be improved. We think that change, it hasn't solved all the problems at Facebook, but is really meaningful moving forward. And I think, I think moving away towards an independent board chairman is the right move for Facebook long term and is good for long term, again, social ramifications and long term shareholder value. And generally, best practice is to have that independent chairman. You see, Google, Apple, Microsoft, Oracle all have independent chairmen. And Microsoft is kind of an interesting example when you look at this really on both of those issues, because obviously right around the turn of the century, Microsoft was mired in a lot of different scandals. And really 2 moves came out of that period when they were in the headlines with a lot of scandals. One was moving to an independent board chair. And the second was they set up a risk oversight committee. It was actually called a public policy committee. Microsoft did not want to do it at the time. It was part of one of the mandated pieces of the settlement that they had with the Department of Justice, was to have a public policy committee to look at public risks for a period of 10 years. What was interesting was that after the 10 years was up and they were allowed to disband the committee, they chose to keep it. And over that period of time, they realized that there were useful conversations happening, and that, again, I think certainly Microsoft is a much less controversial company than it was before. So I think, very common in the kind of the maturing of a company, maturing of a tech company, that mindset shifts. Innovation is very important at Facebook. Trust probably is more important now. And so what are some of the changes you do when you really are focused on maintaining the trust of the public and the trust of investors?
Mariella, I think I heard you call yourself an optimist a little while ago. Is that
yes,
so?
I am.
And
yeah,
why?
I am. And I think we should be, all of us, and because we can really leverage our shareholder power together to engage with the companies. And I think we are at the intersection of really changing shareholder responsiveness from the tech companies, and a new governance model, which again, in addition to privacy and security, we believe that bringing sustainability as part of the board culture and long-term strategy and conversation is important. If you think about digital privacy and security, there is another sector, financial services sector, that for both IT and financial services, privacy and security is equally material, yet the companies have responded differently. And I believe that the lack of risk management culture for the tech companies, and also a compliance culture, the lack of regulation, I think has been a reason that we are dealing today with this issues with respect to privacy and security. What is a company's responsibility to provide the right use of data and to provide its users or customers security. But it's not only about privacy and security. As ESG investors, we also look at issues of human capital management and diversity, and it's a big issue for us because 76% of technical jobs in technology companies in the United States are occupied by men. So there is a big opportunity for women empowerment. And in our conversations, in our communication to the tech companies, we'll have questions about how they envision working and partnering, for instance, with technical universities or colleges in order to provide channels for women gaining technical education and finding jobs and professional career development within the tech sector. Though that's something diversity and good human capital management really should be looked at the board level as a long-term strategy. For Amazon, for instance, the largest e-commerce company in the world, physical and labor issues, like we heard yesterday on a panel on modern slavery, this is really material, how they manage their human capital, productivity, and also providing good disclosures. For us investors, traditionally, lack of disclosure has been a barrier to making an informed investment decision. So we rely on talking with companies because of that. So, I mean, issues of human capital management, digital privacy, and I should also mention executive compensation, because for the tech companies, aligning growth opportunities in innovation with a long-term pay for performance metrics, it's really very important, and we've been engaging with several of them on that as well.
Melanie, you painted a broad picture of the power of technology. How do we get there? How do these investors, what tools do they need to get there?
Great, thank you. It's really, really interesting because one of your slides said no rules. And what's been interesting when it comes to sustainability and environmental and climate-related technologies, in the hardware space, there have traditionally always been rules, whether it's environmental laws, regulations that govern prior informed consent with communities, or how we build or how we view the environmental impact of those hardware technologies. Where you've gone to this no rules environment is when it comes to the software platforms and the technologies. And so much aligned with what Will was talking about what are the new questions we need to be asking about. And in the case of, for Facebook, how do you encourage a broader view at the tech company level? What are some of the tools or the questions that we ask ourselves that really help us understand and better evaluate what are the range of the consequences we need to be thinking about? And the first one in particular is really how to identify the unintended consequences of the technology and what's the role investors can play in asking those questions and identifying some of those unintended consequences. Let me give you an example. In the case of solar homes or solar platforms that help you put solar on your roof or solar in your community or solar at the city level, those platform technologies, they're algorithms, they work with utility companies, they help the utility better integrate clean energy into the grid or at the home level. All great uses of technology, great climate impact. But an unintended consequence could be, well, what's the impact on the overall energy costs for low-income communities or low-income families, and to really think through those consequences of a technology platform. The second sort of tool that we've been looking at is identifying what are the social consequences in the development or the use cases of the technology. This again is getting to the questions that Mariella mentioned, asking some of these gender questions, not just in terms of governance. So if you look at it gender just from the governance lens of how many women are in the C-suite or how many women on the board, you then all of a sudden overlook or don't actually proactively look at the role of gender plays in environmental issues or the social issues within that technology deployment or development. And that actually kind of triggers that third piece of our toolkit, which was really looking at the fluidity among the ES and G silos, and really kind of taking, when it comes to technology, especially on the software side, it's harder to look at them as each as within E, S, and G having sort of line items you look at and you ask questions about and check those boxes, because that inadvertently will close you off to others. And so an example I guess I would give is on the gender component. What's really interesting about your stat, you said 76% of tech jobs are occupied by men, but yet women are on the forefront of consumer product use and adoption. And so really looking at how do you marry those two, which is if your end user and your consumer of the product is actually going to be female, then what's the role of that female voice, that female brain, and that female knowledge in the development of the technology and ultimate use case. Also looking at the idea of how women are uniquely positioned to deliver those solutions to technology, but also in the case of climate change, disproportionately affected oftentimes by the impacts of climate change. And so you put in one of your slides the Nest thermometer or home solutions. Again, what's the role that we can look at in terms of looking at environmental issues such as home heating and cooling and the technologies involved in that, but the role that gender plays in those technologies as well. And so really looking at thinking about, within those silos, how do you see some of those cross-cutting issues? And we really see climate change as a thematic that cuts across all those three pillars, and that's really been a lens we've been using.
We're going to go to questions in a minute, so think of at least one good question or more. But Pooja, one of the things from much of the discussion here has been about the view from developed economies, certainly the United States and Europe. You stand out because you're focused on emerging markets. Is there a difference?
Absolutely. I mean, we've had a lot of discussion with the other panelists on the role of shareholders in the investment process to drive change. And, it's great that Trillium was able to engage with Facebook to make certain changes around the Risk and Audit Committee. But, in a democratic context, this might work, but in a different political context, so in maybe a communist context like China, the government is the most important stakeholder in many cases, and maybe not minority investors. And so how do you then make your voice be heard? Because engagement is still very early days. Many requests for engagement, have not really been responded to positively. So the way we approach it in our case case is that we use our voting process and our proxy voting process in a very active and powerful way, and we really want to use our vote to signal satisfaction or dissatisfaction with certain policies. And then on top of that, it's really about integrating the risks that we've observed in these businesses into our valuation methodology when we are looking at stocks and portfolio construction, so that we appropriately reflect the level of risks in figuring out where we want to be positioned. But it is my hope and our effort that we will continue to push for increased engagement in emerging markets going forward.
Questions? Gentleman standing up in the back there. If you could tell us your name and your affiliation.
Does it work? Does it work? Okay. Theo Clement, UBS. There was an interesting article last Monday in the Wall Street Journal from a journalist who covered the financial sector for years and also during the financial crisis, and was very happy that several years ago she got reassigned to the IT sector. And she wrote about it, so she was very relieved. But now she describes there in a very interesting article that the behavior of the financial sector at that time, she sees that running up exactly in the whole sector you are describing. And people think they can walk over water. Yeah, now not that many people can do that, history has shown. But what do you think as shareholders? Because I was hoping that you would react more on this one also. I see the importance of, let's say, IT technology and whatever, that it brings a lot of good to the world also. But this part is completely under let's say, covered, I would argue. How these companies behave, what they do with privacy, with trust, and that behavior can be very also disruptive going forward. Would you share that view? And should we do more as shareholders?
I think I hear a challenge to optimism in this question.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's an excellent question. Thank you so much. I have experience with working with the bot sectors, financial services, engaging with some of the biggest US banks right after the financial crisis on similar issues of compliance with regulation, risk management, privacy and cybersecurity, and board oversight. And today, when I talk to big financial services, they said that they actually collaborate. They see interest from their counterparts of chief digital officers from the tech companies, trying to ask for best practice and how to go about building these governance structures of compliance, ethics, and risk management. So there's this cross-sectoral transfer of knowledge, you can call it, between the two sectors, and there are networks of digital officers from different sectors, especially financials and tech companies, when they're brainstorming, what kind of a system they should build in place in order to protect privacy and security. So in this way, I'm really hopeful that the technology companies, under the pressure of more regulation coming from Europe, we'll see what happens here in the US context, that they'll really build potentially those governance structures that, and in a couple of years, they will be as sound, hopefully, as the financial services, which have much more mature governance models.
Anyone else?
Just because it's a related point is, I think what's emerging now in technology is this awareness of the systemically important companies, and that certainly initially that terminology came around the financial crisis and systemically important financial institutions. I know many members here are taking part in the Climate Action 100 with energy companies around systemically important energy companies related to climate change. And I think what we are seeing is the large ubiquitous tech platforms are systemically important as well. And that systemic importance requires an additional risk oversight. And so I think there are lessons to learn from the financial sector that could be applied to the technology sector.
Another question? Woman over here. Yep.
Hi, Julie Tanner from Christian Brothers Investment Services. Thank you for the presentation. I had a question about the level of responsibility and expense that you think various tech companies have for the content flowing through their platforms, and how does that impact their business models, and if you think that response should be higher. One of the issues we work on is child sexual exploitation in the tech sector. So obviously there's so many issues facing the sector, but curious if you could talk about content and what you think tech companies are doing, should be doing. And also just wanted to put in a plug for the newly created Investor Alliance for Human Rights, and tech is going to be one of the sectors that we're looking at. There's going to be a webinar September 25th. And if folks don't know the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, it was started by the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, but now includes folks like Shift on the steering committee, New York State, Christian Brothers, Sisters of Mercy, and it's over 50 signatories with $2 trillion in assets, and this is going to be a core, area for them. And so this is one of the topics that we're talking about now. So anything you all could add on the topic would be great.
I'll jump in if you don't mind, because the content area is one that Open Mic has devoted a lot of energy to, and I've been involved in a lot of it, written about it. And it's one of the thorniest and most difficult issues to confront. And part of the challenge is these companies position themselves as neutral technology platforms when they've morphed into becoming media companies. And while the challenge is that while there is a lot of hateful, dangerous content on their platforms, how do you define what hate speech is? How do you define what exploitation, sexual exploitation is? And the challenge that you confront, and I can tell you there are hundreds of experts and various groups trying to address those issues and define what is hate speech. And if you take content off, and it's beginning to happen because Facebook's getting more aggressive about trying to address some of these issues, and when they take content off in one place, it raises issues about whether that's fair, is there appeal, how do you get back on, and also the laws that would apply in the United States and developing countries, how do they impact folks in less developed countries, where in some countries Facebook is the internet in less developed countries. So if you deprive people of access to Facebook, and how do governments define hate speech? And many of the definitions of hate speech that some people would have us adopt in this country can be turned around by oppressive governments to deprive others. So there's no simple solution. Does anyone else want to jump in here? I mean, it's a very difficult problem.
I think what's actually interesting is for Facebook, of course, I'm going to talk about Facebook, but Facebook and the New York Times are interesting compare contrast, because the New York Times has a dual class share structure. And the reason that they say they need that is to be able to make content editorial decisions and don't want that to be too financially driven. And Facebook, to some extent, will make a similar argument for why they have a dual share class. But there's a really key distinction there, and that is that Facebook doesn't consider themselves a publisher, and they don't own the content. They don't make those editorial decisions. So kind of trying to have it both ways, where they get this dual share class structure so they can be insulated and make their decisions. But if they're going to want that benefit, then we feel that there needs to be more ownership, and for them to take at least some of those kind of publishing responsibilities.
And one final thought, there are, and this will sound crazy, but there are people who think that Facebook may be too big, that it may be unmanageable, and that the Facebook business model may be fundamentally flawed because it is too big, and what is definition of hate speech in one community in the United States here in San Francisco may be very different from the definition of hate speech in Africa. And how do you moderate all of that? Another question? We have time for a couple more. Yep. Here at the front.
Thank you. It's a great presentation. You talked about a rules-free environment. Are there any rules or standards emerging that you think are important in terms of risk mitigation, or are there areas where you think there should be rules or standards emerging that would assist with the risk mitigation at the companies?
I can take this. I think some areas that we have seen rules and standards emerge is in healthcare safety in China. So Baidu had a key issue, I think this was 2 years ago, where there was information posted online about treatment of cancer and alternative treatment of cancer. And then there was a patient, a university student, who decided not to undergo conventional chemotherapy and then use this alternative product. And as soon as he started using this product, he passed away. And there was a big social kind of revolt in China against Baidu at the time. And so the rules that they have been developed rules now around the quality of products that are posted. There's a much stronger quality control team. And the government has actually started to take a pretty big stance on this. So one thing that they've started doing is having what's called a party committee representative on the board of directors of all Chinese companies, actually. One of the roles of these party committee representatives is to make sure that businesses don't behave in unethical ways. But of course, this is a double-edged sword because it's going to be a way for them to kind of forward their own propaganda. So I suppose maybe the solution is that companies proactively themselves start to regulate internally and have rules in place to assess the quality of information that goes in there.
All right, I'm going to have one last question for the entire panel, and surprise question, but take out your crystal ball if you can. Look forward, not way into the future, but maybe 3 years. I'll start with you, Mariella. Give us a prediction of something that will be happening 3 years from now that we don't anticipate now.
Well, what we see here in the United States, and it's a very strong and unprecedented phenomenon, and it's a really very high level of consumer corporate engagement. Also employee engagement. We see employee energized within the big tech companies, making decisions and trying to have an impact on a business strategy and where the business model is heading, like with Google, potential entrance in China. The employees are very outspoken. We see this high level of energy also with investors, which hopefully we can have our impact, and also from the chief executive officers as well. I mean, there is this unusual level of CEO activism that over the past 2 years we've seen here, whether it's on issue on climate change, on immigration reform. And I have to say, I really want to give credit to a lot of big tech companies speaking up on behalf of human rights with respect to immigration and showing leadership. So there's an opportunity to take a position and to improve, and we see that happening.
Okay. Melanie, I'm going to ask you all to keep it short now because my clock tells me we're running out of time.
Sure. 2021, there's some political things I could say here, but I won't. I think the crystal ball is related to technology and the social sector. I think what I would see happening in that year time frame is conferences like this and others that are focused on responsible investing will feature a much broader, even broader suite of participants who have come into this sector and are investing their capital aligned with whether it's ESG or ESG++, and this notion of ESG versus impact, or how those two correlate. I think we'll increasingly see the economic impact, positive economic impact consequences of what's been sort of the foundations being laid today and in the most recent years, really generating really strong returns and bringing many new, more diverse players into this mix.
Well?
Yeah, I mean, I think Michael, open mic is kind of our crystal ball that we use at Trillium. So that's hard to say. But yeah, I think, this whole idea, I think growing awareness around the risks involved with large technology companies, and then maybe a rethinking of some of the tech exceptionalism where we kind of let tech companies play by different rules. I think that's not going to persist forever.
And Pooja?
So I'm just going to kind of put out a controversial thought here and play it out to the extreme, that there's a possibility, I think, maybe a probability, that internet companies, at least in countries like China, end up being extended arms of the state and could be the future of a state-owned entity eventually. And perhaps internet lending by private companies ceases to exist, and it's the state that controls the lending mechanism going forward. And the internet companies kind of become a service provider to the state and creating their cloud infrastructure and become data providers to the state. So yeah, that's just some food for thought.
On that very provocative note, I want to thank our panel, and I ask you to join us.